Good evening, everybody. My name is Kim Dorman. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library, and I'm delighted that you're all here joining us for this very special evening with two much-loved Princetonians. I just wanted to take a note to offer some housekeeping notes. We have the live transcript going, so anybody who would like to use the live transcript can enable that themselves at the bottom of their screen. We are also recording this, so it'll be available in the future on the Princeton Public Library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions or concerns at any time, you can enter them in the Q&A function or the questions, or you can chat us at any point during the program. The panelists will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, at which point we'll take questions from the audience. It is my delight to be able to introduce you to Ingrid Reed. Ingrid Reed is an active policy analyst focusing on New Jersey civic affairs and was the director of the New Jersey project at Rutgers Eagleton Institute of Politics until she retired in June 2010. She was a founder and served on the board of a successful startup, New Jersey Spotlight, a civic journalism website designed to provide coverage of current state issues important to its communities, which merged with NJTV in 2018, and also a fabulous and much loved member of the community. Please join me in offering a virtual welcome to Ingrid Reed.
Thank you, Kim. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so glad to be here with Peter Lindenfeld. His book, Fragments of Time, is just so interesting, and Peter has been an active member of our community. His family has been, and so to have this special opportunity to talk with him about his life, which interests me so much because of him, but also because it illustrates that government can do good and government can do bad, and citizenship is just so dependent on that relationship with what government is. And Peter certainly has a life to prove that it does make a difference, if it's good or bad. And I'm glad to say that when we started discussing this, we agreed this was not a celebrity tell-all book, but it was actually a book that was taking the reader in mind. If you read this book, you may find yourself thinking about your own journey that Peter describes. In fact, Peter, the very last sentence in your book is, "This book is part of me. I send it out with the hope that you will find resonance with thoughts and observations that are familiar and some that are not." So right from the beginning, even though it's the last sentence, you were thinking of what it means to be a reader of your book. People have a choice, but I think many will follow your lead to think about their own life. We also don't have a spoiler alert with this because we can say happily, it has a happy ending. and what you tell us is basically how you got to that point. I guess people have read the little summary that says, from a secure childhood in pre-war Vienna to the challenges of immigration, adaptation, and pursuits in science and education and social change. That's what the book is about. So for today, Peter, we agreed that you would give about 4 readings from the book and that we'd have a conversation here and there that might provide some insights into what happened on your long journey of life. So why don't we get started with, as they say, no ado, and pick up on that first piece that says a secure childhood in Vienna. And we know that right from the beginning, that changed. So to get us to think about what you really faced in a childhood, can you do a little bit of a trip through the places that you and your mother had to go through in order to find a base for a more secure childhood? You left Vienna, and then what happened?
Well, it was quite an odyssey. My father stayed behind, and can talk about that later. He wasn't going to go because he thought the Nazi times could not last, as many people did. And of course, that was not a workable hypothesis. My mother was intent on leaving. And she first went with me to Italy, where she had been born, in Trieste. And we stayed there only for a few days. And it turned out at that point that I had tuberculosis. And her first task was to find a place for me. And she did. I went for the next 8 months to a sanitarium in Switzerland where she deposited me and left. I have no idea just how that worked, but I suspect that they let me stay there without pay. And she went to England, where she was first a housemaid and then worked in a hostel for refugee children until she decided that I should come because she had gotten the permission for both of us to come to Canada. The way that happened is that she had a friend in a feminist club in Vienna. This is the early 30s, but there was a feminist club, and that my mother certainly belonged strongly to that. And we made our way to Western Canada, where she had that friend who made it possible for about 10 to 15 people to be there and get a new start in life. It was on Vancouver Island in a forlorn corner. And that's where both of us spent the first summer away in the house of Aha Askenazi, known as Aha for her initials, who was the one that made this possible. And all of us, all 15 or so, got to start that way. And in the fall of that year, my mother found an apartment in Vancouver, and I started school. She worked. She had been a physician, but of course had no permission to work as a doctor. So she used a small machine that she had carried all the way to do electrolysis, an electrolysis machine, which made it possible for her to remove hair from people's faces or wherever. And that's what she did for several years in order to gain some money. She had been told that she could regain her license if she went to a medical school in Canada for a year. But of course, she had to amass some money first to be able to do that. So eventually she did that, and to nobody's surprise, she failed the exam. She had not been in school for 20 years. And she tried 3 times before that happened, and then set up a practice in Vancouver.
So a strong woman that had to pursue her own life, but also to be your mother, which meant that you probably learned a lot being on your own. And maybe we should skip to the first reading, because as you became a teenager in growing up in Canada, and we should probably salute Canada for being hospitable to immigrants and giving you some opportunities. You learned that your father had found you and returned and was coming to Canada. So why don't you read from your book about that new start in your life?
Okay, thanks, Ingrid. Let me say first that I was very fortunate in the school that I went to. I went to a public high school in Vancouver, mm-hmm. And it had an amazing effect on me. I can still remember the teachers and what I learned there. I didn't know a word of English when I started. And I remember the English teacher as laying a foundation for me that is still the foundation for what I do in writing and in talking.
Wonderful.
I finished high school, mm-hmm. And after that, I worked for a year. And that was the time when my father came. He had been, well, let me read this.
Yes, yeah, I think it's okay. A wonderful paragraph, yeah.
All right, let's try. My father had stayed behind when my mother and I left Vienna. He was arrested soon after and sent to the concentration camp Buchenwald, which about 500,000 people did not survive. Although the rules were never clear, some people, at least, could be released if they had a place to go. This was still before the war. It was not possible later. My mother found someone who paid for a ticket to Shanghai, which was the only place we knew where you did not require a visa. He didn't go there, but made his way to England, where he was interned as an enemy alien and sent to Australia. When he was freed, 3 years after we left Vienna, my mother was in school herself, and only I was there to welcome him when his ship docked in Vancouver. There was no particular show of emotion on my part. I was focused on what I needed to do. There were only the two of us, and I was in charge. I knew my way around. I wanted to show him where he was and was going to take care of him. We lived in a room where the rent of $15 a month was paid somehow, and all other expenses came from what I earned. And I was proud of to be the only wage earner in the family. He never talked about his time as a prisoner or about his early life. I regret that I was not more insistent on drawing him out. He received the permission to take the exam to get his medical license back without any of the obstacles that had been put in my mother's way, and passed on the third try. He was now more than 60 years old. After some months, my parents were more or less independent, and I was free to resume my studies.
What story? As you took on more responsibility. The last word in that paragraph is studies, which is a kind of good way to start thinking about what you were thinking about going to college in British Columbia, I guess. You had mentioned to me that you felt you still needed to have more studies in English before you set off on a college career. Is that, did I remember that right? That you were working.
When I started high school, I had 2 years of high school in Vancouver. And when I started, I didn't know any English. But you know, at that age, I suppose for everybody, it comes relatively easily. Right. And certainly after those 2 years, in fact, after a semester, I was functioning, and after 2 years, I was fluent. And although you know there were problems, and you can still hear it in my voice, I don't think that was a major obstacle after that.
After that, okay. But as you thought about going to college, you really didn't know very much about what your choices were at college and what direction to take.
That's right. I chose engineering because I understood what that was, and I knew it would lead to a job.
Right.
And that was very important at that time. When I graduated, some years later, that was no longer a big concern. My parents were settled and they didn't need me. And it's at that point that I switched to physics. But the engineering was the start, and I graduated in electrical engineering. And that was the foundation of my studying.
But all the time you were also working, you had a whole host of interesting jobs.
But that was only during that first year before I started.
Before you started, as you got ready to go, yeah. Was education free in British Columbia where you were studying? How did that work in terms of making your way through?
When I started college, I got a scholarship under a government program. Actually, it was a loan. And the second year, that was more or less renewed. And then I got a scholarship with that paid the tuition. So I think I only paid for tuition of 1 year out of all those years.
Well, I think that,
yes, as you said before, government help was crucial, because although the tuition was ridiculously low compared to what people pay today,
right,
at the time it was significant, especially if you didn't have any money.
Right. So we really should thank Canada for being open to helping immigrants make their way in the world.
Well, understand that we came, this whole group that came to Vancouver Island that I described, they came as farmers. Now that was a big stretch. These were people who'd never lived anywhere except in the city of Vienna.
Right.
And I don't think that they knew which end of the cow to go to. But there was, in fact, a cow, and there's a picture of it in the book. And that's how we got to start.
Right.
But it was not totally honest to say that we were farmers.
Well, you probably produced enough to be able to have that label for a while, at least. So you made it through sort of what we think of as undergraduate college, and then you had we're looking ahead, I believe, to come to the East Coast, and there's a wonderful piece in your book where you were thinking about where you should apply in coming east, and we should say that it was the beginning of your journey in the United States that finally brought you to Princeton. But could you read the section about where you learned that that Yale was looking for people with your background for a graduate program?
Well,
tell us how that worked out.
It's not clear that that's what they were doing, as you will see. I had switched to physics, and I stayed in Vancouver to try to get started in physics as a graduate student. And that's where I start here. While I was a graduate student in Vancouver, the chair of the Yale physics department was a summer visitor. He was upbeat and jovial and got to know the three of us who were engaged in research in nuclear physics. He assured us that there would be no problem for us to be admitted to Yale as graduate students. We were pleased with that and planned on it. And we were stunned when the time came to get 3 rejection letters. 2 of us had applied also to other schools. The third had nowhere to go and asked to be put on the waiting list. When fall came, he was accepted, and he was the first of the 3 of us to graduate from, in his case, from Yale. And the 2 of us were elsewhere and still struggling. The other 2 of us changed gears and went to our second choice schools. I had no one to talk to about this and got my information from graduate school catalogs. I had applied to Columbia without thinking that I would actually go there. A member of the admissions staff passed through Vancouver and interviewed me. I described my work with some confidence and was accepted with a teaching assistantship that would pay for my tuition and living expenses. I was excited that I would be in New York and living at International House around the corner from the campus. Just how badly prepared I was would only become apparent later.
So now what happens next? You get your degree from Columbia, and we finally get to the New Jersey part of your life. Rutgers was the next place that you went, right? I guess you must have had a good time in New York. That must have been a fun time as you sort of got to know
a good time, but the Columbia experience was very difficult. I found myself there at a time which a number of my fellow graduate students remember as being really tough on them. In many schools, once you're accepted as a graduate student, the department sort of feels a responsibility to keep you and get you graduated. That was not the case at Columbia. There were a number of exams, particularly a qualifying exam, which if you didn't pass it, and sometimes on the second try, you were out on the street. Now, I passed that, but I remember going in to apply for taking the exam, and that was at the end of my first year there. And I remember the rather famous professors, there were 2 of them in a small office, looking at me with some surprise and making it clear that they didn't think I was ready for that. Well, turns out it was okay. And I then had to try to find an advisor. and her first one, and then a very famous one, well, somebody who became very famous, but who was so intent, he was an assistant professor at the time, so intent on his own work that he really didn't look over his shoulder to see whether I was following or not.
Right.
But yes, it did lead after some time to a degree.
And a more focus to your studies in physics? Did you begin to think about the research that you might do? Because then you went to Rutgers, right?
Well, I did not think about that until I was at Rutgers. Most of my fellow graduate students looked for jobs where they could, in fact, continue what they have been doing for a thesis.
Right.
You know, they were in a certain stream and they were hired because of that experience. I didn't do that. I was working in particle physics with Jack Steinberger. And at that time, the machines were getting bigger, the groups were getting bigger. It was all sort of getting more and more impersonal. And I didn't think that was for me. Rutgers was just emerging from a time when, before the war, there was no research to speak of done in the physics department. And one of the people who was there just before the war was given the task of making a research department from scratch. And he did that. And I came at a point where the department decided to really concentrate on research. And from that time on and to this day, it was primarily a research department. It turns out that I was hired for a particular task, for teaching a course in radioactivity and radioactive materials, which would then be required for everybody who worked with radioactivity or nuclear physics in the whole of the university. And the chemistry faculty member and I set up a lab and a course and a new curriculum. And that was my first task for the first couple of years at Rutgers. At the same time, I did want to do some research, and that got me started, but I did not realize at that time just how crucial it was for me to actually produce some research results. Well, that became apparent rather quickly.
Well, why don't we stop there and say that being a professor in a department at Rutgers was a new stage in your life. And I guess by that time you had married Lori, known as Lori Lindenfeld, here in Princeton. And a lot of us knew Lori and really admired her artwork. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about her background, because it really is fascinating. She was also finding new ways of obviously exercising her great artistic talent. And we'll do that before we talk about how you finally got a house here.
Okay.
What about Lori? Can you tell us about her background?
She had been a refugee, not from Vienna, but from northwest Germany, a town called Wuppertal. She'd been in art school, and on Kristallnacht, September 39, she was told at one point not to go home. And she and her family left overnight. And by the time I met her, she was in New York. But her education and what really shaped her work was that she had, by an accident, found her way to Black Mountain College in North Carolina, near Asheville, where a number of people from the Bauhaus in Germany were teaching, principally Albers and his wife Annie Albers, who was a weaver. And that European background that Lori had continued to some extent at Black Mountain College, where they were the teachers from the same place close by where she had lived. And that really gave her the foundation that was ideal for her. When I met her, she was in a one-room apartment in New York with most of the space taken up by a loom, which was made for her. She worked for a company as a designer, and the company bought that loom for her. All the executives piled into a car one day on her direction, and they went to Long Island, somewhere where a man was building these looms by hand. And they were rather dubious when they saw that, but did get her the loom, and that was the basis of her work. She would work first in her apartment, and later when we got married in our home, in the kitchen, which was the only room large enough, and go to New York first several times a week and eventually less, with a dozen or 2 dozen samples each week.
Wow.
And I would see these little strips of stuff that she wove at home. And if they accepted a particular sample, I would sometimes see large bolts of materials in the windows, and in the best windows. We're talking about Fifth Avenue and rather famous outfits for which she designed the fabrics. And she was extremely successful with that, using that basis of Black Mountain College aesthetics for what she did. And she did that until we had our second child, and she felt that she could not go on and continue to do this. Eventually, she worked at home and produced fabrics of tapestries of various sorts, one of which I gave to the library. I think actually it's in somebody's office right now. It was in the hallway for a while. And there's also one in the municipal building that she made. And she became quite successful. Successful in the sense that people like you would know about her, not successful in the sense that she would make any money off this. It was too slow a process, and just not something that lent itself to production, certainly not mass production. So it was something that she did and was extremely good at, and that fulfilled her.
And I think she was a pioneer, I think, in helping people appreciate that weaving was an art form, and was very valued in the community. So now we have to say, well, how did you get into the community? And since a lot of people in Princeton now are interested in real estate and how you acquire housing and so on, you and Lori were living, I think, in an apartment near New Brunswick or something, and decided that maybe you should start thinking about a house, but it was really sort of a fortunate circumstance that you happened to be in Princeton. So how about you read the section on the house?
Let me just start by saying that Lori was a lot more risk averse than I was, and the idea of planning for a house was just totally foreign to her. And what happened was the following. So let me read it. After I started at Rutgers, we were invited by my colleague Ernest Linton and his wife to spend the summer in their house in Princeton while they were away in Europe. It was a great vacation for us from the hot apartment in North Brunswick where we lived. We walked around the neighborhood, that is now in Princeton, along an empty stretch with only a footpath. One day I went to the town office to ask who owned the land. I called up Mr. Cottledew, the owner, and yes, he would be ready to subdivide the property and put it up for sale. Would we come and meet him and his wife in his front yard on the next street in back of the area that we were looking at? He had retired from a local bank and was in a wheelchair when we came, waiting with his wife to look us over. We must have passed muster, since he called a short time later to say that there would be 3 lots, one of them 6 feet wider and costing $200 more. We thought about that for a long time, since even the lower price of $3,200 was more than we had ever spent on anything. I had no reserves, I had zero money, but Lori had worked as a designer and had enough to get us going on that. So we agreed on one of the smaller lots and went to the ceremonial closing with Rose Cortelyou signing for her husband. And it took us 2 more years then to take the next step.
And the next step was actually building a house, right?
Well, that was a challenge. Laura, with her training and bent for aesthetics, had very specific ideas of how and where we were going to live. It was certainly not going to be a development. It had to be an individual place and couldn't be like neighbors' houses. So it took 2 years to find something that she thought was suitable. And the way that happened is that we visited her parents, who lived in just outside of Boston at the time. And we drove around and saw various places, and she found this one, a group of houses that were built by students of Walter Gropius, who had been the founder of the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus being the most important and best known school of architecture and design in Europe, in Germany, and that was her heritage. So to find a house built by the students of the founder of the Bauhaus was something rather special. And I'm now sitting in that same house that was built in 1957.
Right.
We first lived in and around New Brunswick for 4 years. I got to Rutgers in 1953. And this house where I am now sitting was built in 1957.
And it's still, I can attest to the fact that it's still there. It's a classic 1-story mid-century house. And you're fortunate that you're overlooking the playing fields by the Valley Road School, and they've been there for a long time too. And we should add here that the house was also the home for Thomas and Naomi, your 2 children, who then went on to Princeton schools. And while all that was going on, you continued to be a professor and then a distinguished professor and so on at the Rutgers physics department, and won lots of honors. And before we go to my favorite piece from the book, Peter, could you just try and explain in a sentence or two that we who do not know a lot about physics know what it was that really interested you? Where did you do your research? Where did you bring new light to that field of science? Just so we can honor you for that here.
Well, the honors was like coming. You have to remember that at first at Rutgers they were going to fire me. So let me put that in some context here. There were ups and downs with greater swings from one to the other than you might want me to talk about.
Well, that's part of the bumps in the road. We want everybody to be comfortable with that.
Certainly emphasize the fact that some people go in a straight line from somewhere to a glorious end. That's not the way it worked for me. There were lots of ups and downs, and they were sometimes tough and also enriching in many ways. And what interests me most as I think back to that time is that I saw myself as a bridge between the research community and that of first the high school teachers and in general the teaching community. I started some research in low temperature physics. I had heard about Bernie Serin, whose name is now on the physics building. It is named for him. And I had heard about his work in superconductivity, so that when I started, I went to him, got to know him a little bit, and then said, "Can I work in your laboratory?" And he said, "No, I'm not going to continue in superconductivity. There's nothing left to do." Well, that was a very poor prognosis. That's not the way it worked out. It is still a subject that gives rise to surprises and applications that have engaged many industrial and university physicists. But that's where I started, because after he said no, he did in fact find a corner for me, and I set up some experiments. And in particular, I started work on thermal conduction. Now, the only thing I want to mention about that is that it's regarded as an old-fashioned subject. There was no electronics. There were no fancy pieces of machinery. There were resistances and, rather simple tabletop material. And I was rather pleased about that, since I just come from what at that time was the world's largest cyclotron at Columbia. And the work, what I liked about it is that I took this rather old-fashioned looking subject and was able to make something of it. Use the thermal conduction not to find out how much heat was conducted along a piece of material, but rather to probe what was happening between the electrons and the lattice vibrations. And I'm talking about the lattice of atoms which make up the material, that could illuminate the structure. It turned out very quickly that I learned that the thermal conduction, just as is true for the electrical conduction, depends primarily on defects, either impurities or changes in the lattice structure from a regular arrangement. So that these experiments allowed themselves to be used as probes of what was going on a microscopic scale. At the same time, and I don't want to forget that, I started teaching courses for high school teachers.
We're going to get into that.
A major part of my life.
Right. That's a good place to stop, because I selected the part in your book that does deal with high school teachers. And I did that because it really signaled for me your values, your empathy, your willingness to break out of the traditional academic requirements and say, I'm going to do something that I think is in effect good for the world.
Well, you're very generous.
Well, you wrote it, Peter, and
it's not recognized as something particularly important in the department. And it was not the normal course for eventually getting tenure and advancement and so on, but it was something that I really wanted to do. And I'm really happy that you pointed that out.
Right.
Would you like me to read about that?
Yes, would you?
Okay, so it says, from the time when I was a student, teaching had come easily to me. Once I understood a subject, I could organize it so that it also meant something to others. From close to the time that I came to Rutgers, I taught courses for high school teachers. I got grants that subsidized the teachers so that they could come in the evenings and get credit for them in their school systems. High school courses were widely seen to have stagnated and to be out of touch with modern developments and methods. Initially, I thought that the greatest need was for more knowledge of physics. Many of the teachers had taken only a single physics course in college, or had started as teachers of chemistry or mathematics. I soon realized that other dimensions needed to be considered. The teachers were often creative and imaginative, but the school systems could be stifling and bureaucratic. Most schools had only a single physics teacher, so that each worked without colleagues in the subject. The courses and programs at Rutgers gave them contact with other physics teachers and provided them an intellectually stimulating atmosphere.
And I'm sure that you can't even begin to figure out, or we can't begin to figure out how many young people then had a much better opportunity to learn physics as a result of their teachers having that kind of a good experience. Well, Peter, there's much more in your book. Life goes on. And I think we've touched on some things that people would have in common with you, not in the details, but in the way life goes. That there are people who influence you, that help you. There are challenges that you have to meet, and sometimes it probably seems too hard or you can't make up your mind. But your book makes it possible to imagine overcoming challenges and making the most of life. And I hope it inspires other people to look at their life that way, and maybe even do what you suggested at the very end, that they too try their hand at thinking about what life has brought to them. We're very fortunate to have you in the community because you've also committed yourself to good government and our democratic way of life, and are here now still playing a role. But I think we'll stop here and encourage people to continue what else is in your book that is fascinating as you go along. You were very lucky to have experiences all around the world, and people love to read about that too. So I want to encourage them to learn more about what life brought to you after coming to Princeton and being at Rutgers. So I think we promised that we would take an opportunity to have you answer questions if there are any in the chat box. Kim, how are we doing?
Yes, we do have some questions.
Okay.
The first question that I saw was actually from Rush Holt. Peter, among your students, there have been, I think, many non-majors. What is your idea about the importance of teaching physics to non-physics majors?
Well, I'm first of all delighted to hear from Rush, who was, of course, a congressman in this area for, I think, 16 years, and who had an enormous influence on everything that was on here. I am happy to remember that I worked on his campaigns and that I had been a founder of the Princeton Community Democratic Organization. In fact, I think I'm the only one left from those founding days. And that was very important to me. As far as the teaching of physics is concerned, physics is regarded as remote and abstract and distant. And because I spent my life making it less so and making it more human, I think of physics as a liberal subject. I think of the physics book, the textbook that I was eventually involved with, as a book about intellectual history, as it goes through various stages of understanding and synthesis in mechanics, as Newton did, and electricity and magnetism, showing that these are really part of the same subject, that you can't have one without the other. And those are relatively recent developments in the large scheme of time. And I did that principally for students who were going to be science majors. But I also worked on changes in the curriculum. I never taught a course specifically for non-majors. And the reason was that there were very few. There were courses that at that time became somewhat well known, called courses of physics for poets. Well, the problem is that there are very few poets who want to study physics. And I recognize the importance of that, and I knew people who were trying to do that, and I'm totally in favor of that, but it's very hard in college to find a place for something that is not directly related to a major program. So yes, I was involved in that, and I mentioned particularly the work of George Horton, who broke through the barrier that even admission to physics represented. There was a generation, or there was maybe several generations of students who were kept out of physics because there was such a great rate of failures. And by making the subject more human and more accessible, he, and to whatever extent I could, I also made it more accessible, both in the sense of making it more hospitable to all kinds of students, primarily minority students who were traditionally just basically kept out of the subject, but to students who would then do things other than physics. And the greatest number of students that we had in those special courses that we designed went into health sciences. And that effort made it possible for students of all kinds of backgrounds, and in particular minority students, to study physics and be able to enter those programs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ingrid. Go ahead.
It's a wonderful story as we think about maybe many of us never were given the opportunity to even consider the wonders of physics. You have another question for us, Kim?
I do. It's sort of related. Dozier Hammond asks, and you sort of answered this before, what was your relationship with Rush Holt and Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, if any?
Oh, well, Dozier, thank you so much. Delighted to have questions from people that I really know. And Dozier is a friend. And I knew Rush slightly before he became a congressman. But I had no specific relation to the Princeton Plasma Lab. I gave a talk there once, and I knew people there. But the physics I did was really very different. Although I have to say that once I wrote a little booklet for the American Association of Physics Teachers about the work basically related to what is done in the Princeton Plasma Lab. It was a book on fusion devices for physics teachers primarily.
So there was a connection. Do we have another question, Kim?
Okay.
Yeah, Lindsay Kamen asks, Peter, did you ever become involved with or address the physics community in Vienna?
The only thing I did was to write to and send a copy of the book, to the Exilbibliothek, the Library of Exile Literature. And I have been back in Vienna since 1938, just once. I went with Lori. We were going to a conference in Germany. I've been to Germany several times, but there was nothing to draw me to Vienna. I didn't think I knew anybody there, and my memories were, after all, mixed. So I had no contact with anyone there. When I went there with her, I knew every corner. I knew every stone in the road. It was still very vivid in my memory, but I had no contact with people. As it happened, I did meet somebody, and I described that. Meet somebody totally by accident that I knew, but in general, it was a piece of memory. It was a place that I had remembered as if through a veil, as if behind a screen. You know, I was walking through places that were totally familiar to me, but that didn't seem quite real, because I had been away for a long time, and my life as a child was so different. I was so different when I saw it again, that I had very little relation to the reality of Vienna, other than that I remembered what it looked like, what it was like, that there were several kinds of food that it was famous for, and it seemed at the same time to be foreign territory. And I would like to go back there and see it, but that was a time where I would be a tourist and not really a participant. Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah. Any
And
other
I have
questions?
one more question. Tim
Oh, good.
Quinn says, Peter, many of us have the pleasure of knowing you through your involvement with the Democratic Party. What inspired you to start PCDO, which broke with the party leadership at the time?
Well, it brings up a large a group of questions. When I first came to Princeton, I joined the group that met every month as a Democratic club. But there were a few of us who were somewhat dismayed by the way this worked. People got together in the firehouse and drank beer. And it was known as the Firehouse Gang, therefore, and it was all right. There were people that were congenial and talked, but there was no, we chafed at the fact that there was no intellectual content, talks or contact with the community. So about a dozen of us asked the person who was then the director of the plasma lab, Mel Gottlieb, whether he would take on the task of founding a different group. And we got together, this group of about a dozen of us, with him. And he said, well, yes, he would be prepared to do that, but he would make sure that all of us would participate. He wasn't going to do this alone. And that's when he extracted a sort of loyalty oath from us around the room to each one and made them say something about participating and what kind of job they might do, and got us each to sign up for a job before he would consent to saying, well, yes, there's a core here that makes it possible to build on. And that's what happened. And I'm still a member of the executive board. I've been the recording secretary for some 16 years, and I still do that.
Fantastic. John Weingartz asks, when did your interest in American folk music begin?
Oh, John, I was listening to you and your program. No, I had an interest in that obviously before. I am just delighted to hear questions from people that I not only like and know, but admire. John Weingart has a program on Sunday evenings on WPRB, the Princeton station, and it is mentioned in the book as a program of folk music, basically, but sometimes also other things. And it says that I have patterned the book to some extent on what he does in that program, in that there is a theme with variations and, if you like, fragments of time. There are also things that are repeated, sometimes by different performers, and different points of view that shed light on different aspects of a piece. And I can't listen to it every week, but I try hard and have done that for some of the decades that he has been involved in doing that. And I recommend it to everybody on WPRB from 6 to 8 nowadays on Sundays at 103.3 WPRB. How's that for a commercial?
That's great. And it's another aspect of your life that we didn't really cover from taking things from the book. And I want to say that here's the book. It's called Fragments of Time. I think of it as nuggets of time. They're just wonderful stories that are linked together in your spirit of life, Peter, and you've written it beautifully. people can buy it at Labyrinth. I have to do the commercial, and maybe I should say wherever else books are sold. And of course, you can borrow it from the library. And there's much more than we were able to cover today. You've had a rich life, but also we have to be honest. Every life is filled with challenges and some disappointments along the way. But basically, your optimism and your forging ahead is really contagious. It comes through the pages. So thank you very much for the book and for being with us tonight to talk about it and your life. Thank you to the library too.
Let me thank you, and of course the library, Kim and the library, but you for your generosity and for your warm introduction and for your words as you went along this evening.
Well, I think I, like other people, have been inspired to really think about the fragments of my life, like you've thought about the fragments of your life. So I'll say good night. Thanks a lot, Kim. And we're glad to be here at the library for this conversation.
Good night, everybody. Thanks so much. People are chiming in. What a delight. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you all for coming and joining us. And again, the recording will be available on the library's YouTube channel. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.